Hello, everybody, and welcome to this continued education unit. Today's topic of discussion is going to be a sport called CPAC Takraw. And then my name is Ethan Riley. I am a senior at Florida International University, nearing the end of my undergraduate degree in sport and exercise science. So, jumping into it, the agenda for today. I'll be giving you a brief introduction on the sport, as well as the positions of the sport, and then some physical demands, some key performance indicators that we look for, some normative data regarding the physiological and anthropometric profiles of elite athletes, and then some common limitations, so injuries that our athletes will need to be protected from, some relevant information for success, so how we can improve our physical KPIs, and then a sample of a macro cycle for the season. So it would be an off season, um, preseason, and in season, and then look at some training strategies and how to implement them. A quick conclusion, and then below in the description, I'm going to link the CEU quiz for afterwards. So first, CPAC Takraw originated in Eastern Asia, is also known as kick volleyball. It's very similar to traditional volleyball. However, players in CPAC Takraw may only use their feet, knees, chest, and head. And then the rules are pretty similar when it comes to passing. Each team gets three kicks before they must kick the ball over the net. But there are some differences in serving as well that I will get into. So first, I want to show you just a little video on some of the physical demands of the sport actually being played. It just recently got reintroduced to the Olympics, so these are some elite level players playing in this video. First, it's going to show you a couple examples of the serve. Now I'm going to move into a couple of rallies being played. Here's the finish of a spike. Here's an example of a rally. Here is a player attempting to block the spike of another. So you can see it's a very intricate sport with a lot of moving parts. First off, the positions. We have three players on each team on each side of the court. First of which being the server or the taekong. Their job is just to kick the ball over the net, like you saw, um, and of course to make it as difficult as possible for the opposite team to return it. And then we have the striker or killer. They are responsible for striking the ball, as you saw in the video. They jump a lot of times, end up upside down, which is very impressive. And then they want to make it as either as fast of a kick as possible or as slow in order to catch the other team off guard and score a point. And when on defense, the striker is often the player who tries to block the opposite team striker. And then the bowler, setter, or feeder, they are responsible for controlling kind of the other players of the team, usually the leader, and oftentimes the most agile and responsive player on the team. And then finally, the striker or the feeder will actually toss the ball to the server to initiate the serve. And then here's a little picture with a little bit of description on where each of the players stand. The court dimensions, so the court is going to be 20 feet by 44 feet with a center line dividing the court in half. The quarter circles here and here are where the striker and the feeder stand before each point begins. And then the service circle is where the server stands and serves from. And then the net is 1.2 or 1.52 meters or about 5 feet off the ground. So it's not super high. Now into the physical demands. So the type of movements that we see are oftentimes, well, always in all planes of motion. High reliance on anaerobic endurance and power. You can see a lot of acrobatic kicks, rapid changes of direction, and sustained rallies. And then the rallies typically last around 5.5 seconds, with the rest interval for each player averaging about 10 seconds. And then matches will usually last around 20 to 50 minutes, depending on the level of play. The sport is characterized by high intensity anaerobic efforts with brief recovery periods. So there is a reliance on both anaerobic and aerobic energy systems. And then players often perform jumps and kicks. So this subjects the lower body specifically, to high repetitive stress. And then with the duration of the rallies and rest intervals, you can see that the work to rest ratio is more so 1 to 2. Now, some key performance indicators. So, aerobic capacity to begin. Although the sport is typically an anaerobic energy system based sport, players must have a solid aerobic foundation to be able to recover during and between rallies. Anaerobic power is huge, obviously, for executing explosive movements such as jumps, spikes, changes of direction, and then sprint tests, vertical and horizontal jump tests, as well as agility tests, will dictate where our athletes need to improve most. And then muscular strength and power, of course, in the lower extremities. This is going to facilitate our jumps and our changes of direction. Flexibility and mobility, as you saw in the video, is huge. So enhanced range of motion of the hips, the knees, and the ankles, of course, is absolutely crucial for executing serves, high kicks, as well as acrobatic maneuvers. And then balance and coordination. These are both necessary for maintaining stability, both of the pelvis and of the whole body during dynamic movements and aerial plays. Next, how we can improve our physical KPIs. So first, plyometric training. This is going to be huge for power. So box jumps, depth and drop jumps, and then bounding drills should absolutely be incorporated to develop our athletes' power and shorten the SSC. Then for agility, T drills and 5-10-5 drills are really good ways to measure and improve our lateral quickness and the athlete's multi-directional agility. Next, the lower body. So compound movements like split and traditional squats, both back and front squat, lunges, forward and backward, and laterally, as well as RDLs and a hamstring work in general is going to be huge to build strength. And then Olympic lifts like the cleans, the snatches, and the jerks are going to be huge for improving our power as well as shortening the SSC. And then for core stability, anti-rotation exercises like Pallof press and plank variations were going to be huge for improving the stability of the core, which is, of course, essential for balance and aerial control. And then dynamic and static stretching with a focus on active stretches targeting the hip flexors, hamstrings, and the spine to prepare the body for the movements of the sport, both in training and competition. And then post-training sessions using static stretches to maintain or improve joint range of motion, particularly in the hips and the hamstrings. And then endurance development. Things like high intensity interval training can be used, should be used, will be used to simulate match conditions, using repeated sprints and short recovery periods to improve both the anaerobic and the aerobic energy systems simultaneously. And then also incorporating moderate intensity, continuous runs throughout the week to develop that strong aerobic base we were talking about, which is used for recovering between and during rallies. Next, some normative data. So this is going to be the profiles. First, starting off with the anthropometric profiles. So elite players exhibit varying heights and weights across age categories. However, U23 players average around 5'6" and around 137 pounds. And the age range of elite players in Sepak Takraw is around 20 to 29. So 23 is right about in that Goldilocks range of the middle of the pack. And then the physiological profiles. So the VO2 max values range from 49.3 to 54 milliliters per kilogram per minute. So this is indicative of a moderate anaerobic capacity. with body fat percentages of elite players being around 10.5%. And then range of motion and strength profiles. In the U23 neck and trunk range of motion, players were significantly higher than those of U18 and U15, with their range of motion of the neck and trunk being around 145 degrees, plus or minus 9.7 degrees. And then also their ankle range of motion was much greater than those two age groups. And then U23 players, they also exhibited much higher back and leg strength, as well as standing long jump distance and power. Now, for the common limitations, those being injuries, of course. First of all, we have musculoskeletal injuries. So, because of the high frequency of jumps, and aerial maneuvers. This predisposes players to lower limb injuries, of course, including ankle sprains and knee ligament strains, as well as tears. And then head injuries, heading the ball because of a player trying to block another kick, of course, can result in head and neck injuries. Muscular imbalances, these oftentimes show up because of the repetitive unilateral movements, um, and those can, of course, lead to asymmetries in both strength and flexibility. And then overuse injuries, of course, can happen because of the high intensity training without adequate recovery. Um, so those could result in conditions like tendonitis. Next, some relevant information for success in terms of reducing injury risk. We want to make sure that we are strengthening our athletes by using exercises that target most specifically the glutes, the quads, hamstrings, and calves. This is going to make sure that our joints are nice and stable. You can see I underlined hamstrings because within um, knee injuries, ACLs are obviously huge, and hamstrings play the biggest role in providing stability for the knee joint. So we want to make sure that we are hitting our hamstrings heavily throughout the week, both off season and in season. Next, flexibility. We want to use dynamic stretching as well as unilateral strengthening exercises to make sure that we are improving our range of motion both through fascicle lengthening as well as cross-sectional area gains. And then balance using stability challenges through unique loading strategies like unilateral, ipsilateral, or contralateral, um, as well as you see here, single leg exercises. This is going to improve our athletes' proprioception um, through those challenges in stability. And then protective in equipment, mostly during games. Using them during practice can oftentimes lead to more injuries because our athletes' muscles and joints are not used to having to provide stability throughout practices. So a lot more injuries can happen if they are used all throughout practices. So this was mostly for in-game scenarios. Headgear, ankle braces, and knee braces for those sites will help reduce the risk of injury. Now, an example of a macro cycle. So the first phase, phase one, is going to be the off season with a primary focus on anaerobic endurance and power. So the main goal is going to be increasing our motor unit recruitment capabilities by working with moderate to heavy loads and moderate volume, and then using short rest times to build anaerobic endurance to make sure that our athletes are able to deal with metabolite buildup throughout practices and games. And then, of course, we still want to make sure that we are building our range of motion through unilateral exercises. Phase two, or preseason, is going to be a high focus on strength and power. Of course, still focusing on the recruitment of motor units by using heavy loads and higher rest times. We need our athletes to be able to produce as much force as possible for the high power output demands of matches, and then using super and tri sets at the end of workouts to maintain the anaerobic endurance that we built up in the off season. And then finally, phase three, or in season, is going to be a maintenance slash power phase. We're going to focus on heavy concentric only exercises as well as body weight eccentric exercises to aid in monitoring the stresses that we are placing on our athletes' tendons and ligaments during matches. And then we want to, of course, maintain our anaerobic power by continuing the use of plyometrics like altitude drops and depth and drop jumps, as well as Olympic lifts and contrast sets. Now into some training strategies. Of course, for our range of motion, we saw in the video the hamstrings and the hip flexors and adductors are absolutely crucial to perform the physical demands of CPAC Takraw. So this means that our training needs to be through huge, uncomfortable ranges of motion. Of course, we need adequate periodization there, so we can't just start off with super heavy loads, short rest times, and jump right into it. We have to start with high reps, low loads, allow our athletes to recover before we increase both the weight and the total volume. And then the this will lead to improvements in, of course, the cross-sectional area of the muscles as well as fascicle length. So our muscles will be getting stronger as well as more flexible. And then for anaerobic endurance, we know that the average work to rest ratio in CPAC Takraw is 1 to 2. So with this in mind, we adjust our rest intervals during training to push both the glycolytic and oxidative energy systems so our athletes can be well adapted for the demands of CPAC Takraw. And then utilizing again tri and supersets in the weight room, we can facilitate those improvements in our athletes' aerobic and anaerobic energy systems, making them more efficient and better suited for the sport. And then for strength versus hypertrophy, because we saw the anthropometric data of how much the athletes weigh, being around 137 pounds on average, strength is going to take trump over hypertrophy training. So the sport dictates that the athletes must perform aerial movements such as kicks and blocks. Therefore, when an athlete leaps into the ground, all that body mass has to come back down. And oftentimes the players will try to break that fall using their hands. So adding weight to any athlete in CPAC Takraw is only going to increase their risk of injury, especially in the landing of jumps. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of videos. This first one is going to be how we can improve our range of motion while using a resistance exercise. So this is a lateral lunge slide out. Right here, we want to make sure that our athletes are keeping that foot, the plant foot, all the way on the ground. This is going to make sure that the muscle fibers of the adductor magnus are best in line to take on that tension of this exercise. The adductor magnus is considered the fourth muscle of the hamstrings because it aids in hip extension. So we want to make sure that both our adductors and our hamstrings are getting put through huge ranges of motion here, and this exercise is great for doing that. Excuse me, let me get back to go. And then the next video here is going to be an example of how we can use our strength exercises. So this is a very simple example, just a back squat, but you can see here that in terms of body weight, in terms of relative strength, this is a relatively high power output. So this is going to be huge whenever we move into the power exercises or the power phases of this sport. Now, more training strategies. So we move into power. So as I mentioned before, CPAC Takraw players are relatively light athletes in the grand scheme of things. So if we can increase their relative strength, like I said before, which is their absolute strength to body weight ratio, through power-based exercises, it's going to really benefit their ability to perform, especially vertical jumps and changes of direction. So utilizing exercises like altitude drops, depth and drop jumps with variations, of course, for lateral movement, and then Olympic lifts is going to enhance both their force production and their force absorption, which is crucial for landing. And then finally, for in-season training strategies, it's going to look a little bit different. With matches, they often come in the form of weekend tournaments. So it's important that we continue to train power, obviously, because we know that the training residual for max speed is 5, give or take 3 days. So it can be anywhere from 2 to 8 days. So we need to have a heavily speed biased workout either Mondays or Tuesdays. This will allow for the adequate recovery from the weekend tournament and then the adequate recovery leading up to the next tournament throughout that week. And then here is another example of a contrast set. So this is going to be a more power-based exercise superset. So it's going to be 4x4 of continuous trap bar jumps supersetted with 3x3 of depth jumps. So the goal here is to just recruit as many motor units as possible. And to do so, we use a heavy strength-based exercise like the continuous trap bar jumps to fatigue our type 1 motor units of our nervous system. And then we pair that with a body weight ballistic exercise to further recruit type 2 motor units, which are responsible for more quick or rapid explosive movements. And then finally, in conclusion, Sepak Takraw obviously requires incredibly high range of motion of all the muscles of the lower body and the trunk. So training through full, uncomfortable, heavy range of motion through adequate periodization is absolutely crucial. And then, of course, using the work to rest ratios that we saw from the matches that will reflect the nature of those matches is crucial for facilitating improvements in aerobic and anaerobic energy systems that the athletes need for recovery between and during rallies. And then high force output exercises like unilateral strength exercises, plyometrics, and Olympic lifts is essential for improving the motor unit recruitment capabilities of our athletes. And then the average and elite players are separated by flexibility and power. So these two things combined. So maximizing our athletes' potential in both of these categories will absolutely determine their outcomes. How can we improve our athletes from average to elite? And that is mostly separated by flexibility and power. So that is all for the presentation. I am going to link the quiz below. Thank you guys so much for being here. I appreciate your time, and I will see you in the next one.